Chapter 1. The Glass That Reflected Blood. The sea mist rolled in like a slow, deliberate breath, muffling the morning brilliance along the Cornish coastline. Perched precariously upon a cliff that seemed always a moment from surrendering to the tide, the estate of Windward Grange blinked awake. Its lead-glass windows, inset with dull ruby panes, caught only the ghost of the sun, and among them a particular window glinted strangely redder than the rest. Inside, the breakfast room was a study in luxury that resisted time. Wainscoting of dark walnut, paintings of horses with unreadable eyes, a sideboard that had likely been shipped intact from the subcontinent. The mahogany table, stretching like a low altar through the center, bore only the signs of one solitary place setting, and opposite that untouched plate, beneath the blood-colored reflection in the window, sat the master of the house, Colonel Arundel Fairfax, quite dead. The glass beside him was upright, untouched, unshattered, and yet the red within it looked wrong, richer, darker, somehow viscous. Not wine, not cordial. Blood. They found him thus shortly after 9. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Fallon, who let out the first scream, and then she promptly lost consciousness, falling, not delicately, into a side chair with more noise than grace. The butler, Mr. Bickley, followed the sound, saw the colonel's pallid face, and silently crossed himself. By 10 o'clock, the local constabulary had arrived. Inspector Calthorne, a broad man with an unfortunate moustache and a nervous gait, examined the room as though trying to memorize it before some ghost rearranged everything. "No sign of struggle, no weapon, and no wound," he murmured, though the blood in the glass, still fresh, still gently rippling, told another story. "It's his own glass," the maid whispered. "I laid it out not an hour before. The colonel was particular about it. Lead-cut crystal. Always that one. Poison, you think?" Calthorne frowned, crouching beside the colonel's chair. "No scent, but something's odd with the eyes. And that glass, why is it so full, yet so red?" He sniffed it cautiously. Whatever was in it had no smell. No one dared taste it. By 11, a telegram was sent, and by dusk, the most fastidious detective in all of Europe would arrive by motorcar from Paddington Station. But that was later. Now there was only confusion and fear. Windward Grange had been full the night before. A small gathering for the colonel's birthday, his 65th. There had been laughter, port, an abominable little speech delivered by his young niece Cecilia, and an antique piano played rather brilliantly by a Mr. Alan Venn. A roaring fire, laughter. Then, in the early hours, silence. Now those same guests gathered in the drawing-room, wrapped in silence that tasted of suspicion. Cecilia Fairfax, pale and delicate, sat with hands too still in her lap. Her dress was soft blue velvet, but her eyes were harder than anyone remembered from yesterday. Beside her, her fiancé Lionel Grange rubbed his temple with 2 fingers and offered no words. The piano player, Alan Venn, stood near the fireplace, eyes flicking between the others. He was the last to arrive the previous day, and the first to ask if the police had finished poking about. Across from them sat Dr. Hollings, the family physician, and Beatrice Whodunit, the colonel's goddaughter. Beatrice was wearing black, not in mourning, but because she always did. She had not wept. Nor had she looked surprised, and at the door hovered Bickley the butler, ever the ghost of discretion. Inspector Calthorne entered at last, brushing fog from his shoulders. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began with grave authority, "I must inform you that Colonel Fairfax did not die of natural causes. We are treating this matter as suspicious, possibly homicide." A tremor, barely audible, passed through the room like a breath held and released. "And until further notice," he continued, "you will remain at Windward Grange. No one is to leave the estate. Scotland Yard is sending a consultant." "Consultant?" Venn scoffed. Yes, a specialist in these intricate matters. Beatrice Whodunit gave a dry, unsmiling laugh. Let me guess, she said. The one with the mustache. Far from the coast, aboard the 2:45 express from Paddington, a small man with egg-shaped head and exquisitely polished shoes inspected the creases in his gloves. He was not reading the Times. He was not asleep. He was thinking. The telegram had read, "Urgent, unexplained death at Windward Grange. Highly unusual scene. No obvious cause. Presence requested immediately." It had been signed by Calthorne, whom Poirot did not know, and by Dr. Hollings, whom he remembered faintly from a lecture on rare toxins in 1928. Poirot turned his gaze to the blurred English countryside. He did not believe in ghosts, but sometimes he thought a house spoke in other ways. It reflected things: violence, secrets, blood. He allowed himself a small nod. The glass, he thought. Why the glass? It would begin, as it always did, with what was out of place. And in this case, what was too precisely in its place. Chapter 2. The first clues. The fog was thick enough to cling, and Poirot disembarked with great care, shielding his patent leather shoes from the greedy wet earth. Windward Grange rose like a forgotten cathedral behind a wrought iron gate that moaned its age in protest. A uniformed constable escorted him wordlessly up the gravel path, past the stables, the garden trellises sagging with dew, and into the house where secrets had begun to turn foul in their stillness. Inspector Calthorne greeted him in the vestibule with a firm handshake and furrowed brow. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, a touch too loud. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Poirot adjusted his gloves with precision. But of course, when one is summoned to a crime scene where the victim dies with no wound, no noise, and a glass full of blood, one does not linger over coffee. The inspector's mustache twitched. "Quite. This way, please." They entered the breakfast room, which had been left untouched per Poirot's request. The curtains remained drawn, the chair pushed back as though the colonel had merely risen for a moment. The body was gone, but the space still throbbed with something unseen, like the air after thunder. Poirot approached the table. This was his usual seat. "Yes," Calthorne replied. "We've confirmed that from the housekeeper and the butler. Every morning at 8 sharp, and he never drank anything but weak tea or sherry." "Yet the glass is filled," murmured Poirot, "to the brim with something like blood." He bent slightly, inspecting the rim of the glass. No fingerprints. He glanced at the plate. Untouched toast, one soft-boiled egg. Spoon laid precisely beside it. Poirot tapped the spoon with one finger. "May I?" he asked. "Of course." Using a silk handkerchief, Poirot picked up the glass. He turned it against the light from the window, observing how the thick liquid caught on the inner facets of the cut crystal. Then he smelled it. "Not blood," he said softly, "though it mimics the look perfectly. Something thicker, tomato juice, with a dye." He dipped the edge of a folded paper into the liquid and held it up. "No clotting. It has been staged." Calthorne exhaled sharply. "Staged? But of course," Poirot replied. "A man does not pour himself a tall glass of blood-like fluid and then expire tidily in his chair. The theatricality. This suggests a message." Poirot's eyes drifted upward toward the glass panes of the window. "And the sun, it would have struck this pane," he pointed, "and refracted through the red, a stained glass illusion. Clever, symbolic. Who would know the light would fall so?" "Someone familiar with the house's rhythm," Calthorne muttered. "Which means almost anyone here." They moved next to the study. Poirot requested to see the colonel's correspondence and desk drawers, which Bickley opened with grave solemnity. Inside, Poirot found carefully stacked bills, a pistol, loaded but untouched, a folded letter with a broken seal. and a velvet box containing an antique signet ring engraved with the Fairfax crest. "Strange," said Calthorne, pointing at the ring. "He never wore that one. It was a point of family contention." Poirot picked it up with a handkerchief. "Because it was not his." "Exactly. It belonged to his elder brother, Randolph. Died in the war. There was a rumor the colonel had kept it without permission from the widow." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Sentiment disguised as theft, or theft disguised as sentiment." He set the ring down gently. "And this letter? Who sent it?" Calthorne turned it over. "Unsigned. It reads only, 'The past bleeds through always.' Postmarked 3 days before the death." Poirot said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Who was the first to find the body?" "Mrs. Fallon, the housekeeper. She brought him tea at 9. "And before that? Was the colonel alone from breakfast until he died?" Calthorne hesitated. "So far as we know, yes. But the household's morning routine is loose. The guests weren't expected to rise until mid-morning." Poirot nodded, and his voice dropped. "It is curious, mon ami, the perfect staging, the particular glass, the wrong drink, and a man who dies with no visible struggle, no poison in the air, and no mark upon him." He turned back to the glass. "It is not only a matter of what was placed there, but why. A theatrical scene designed not merely to kill, but to speak." That evening, Poirot stood at the upstairs landing, watching the guests quietly disperse to their rooms. He noted Cecilia's stiff spine, the way Alan Venn paused as though sensing eyes on his back, how Lionel Grange waited just a second longer than natural before closing his door behind him. Beatrice Whodunit did not retire. She lingered in the drawing-room, a book open but unread in her lap. Poirot descended slowly. "Forgive me, mademoiselle," he said, "but I wonder, do you think your godfather feared something?" Beatrice met his gaze without blinking. He feared irrelevance, not death. He'd made peace with that long ago, but not being remembered. That would have terrified him. Poirot gave a small bow. Then perhaps someone has made certain he would be remembered. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Windward Grange, for all its yawning halls and ocean-chilled stone, had become claustrophobic by the following morning. The fog had not lifted, and with it came a suffocating tension that seemed to seep into the tapestries and cling to the banisters. The guests, no longer guests but detainees, ate breakfast in silence under the watchful eye of Inspector Calthorne, who stood awkwardly near the doorway, arms folded, trying not to look at the colonel's vacant seat. Poirot sat slightly apart, sipping his coffee without milk, his eyes flicking not between objects, but between people. He was not looking for reactions. He was measuring silences. After the table was cleared and the crockery whisked away by the pale-made iris, Poirot rose. "I believe," he said gently, "it is time we speak to each of you, formally. You will forgive the inconvenience, mais oui? But a man has died, and that death was not natural, and so one among you has lied." A stir ran down the table like a chill. No one met anyone else's gaze. Calthorne cleared his throat. "We'll use the morning room, one by one, if you please." Cecilia Fairfax was the first. She entered quietly, her hands clasped, her dark hair drawn back in a tight plait. She looked younger than her 25 years, but her voice was steady. "My uncle was difficult," she admitted. "Rigid, proud. But I respected him." Poirot tilted his head. "You did not love him?" Cecilia paused. "I wanted to, but I never quite managed it." "You are his heir." Her eyes flickered. "One of them. The will names several beneficiaries. And yet you live here?" "I had nowhere else to go after Cambridge. He gave me the North Wing, on the condition I obey his standards." Poirot steepled his fingers. "And your fiancé, Monsieur Lionel Grange? The colonel approved?" She hesitated. Not entirely. He thought Lionel was charming, but unserious. I think he wanted me to marry someone else. Poirot's eyes twinkled. Did he ever say whom? She shook her head. But he would have liked someone like Mr. Venn, polished, obedient. Poirot made a small note and nodded her dismissal. Lionel Grange, when summoned, seemed agitated beneath his charm. His tie was poorly knotted, and he fiddled with a cigarette he never lit. I'm not what you'd call the Colonel's biggest fan, he admitted. But I didn't kill him, if that's where this is going. Poirot smiled mildly. You were at Cambridge, no? Briefly. I left in my second year. Bit too fond of the roulette table. And yet engaged to Miss Fairfax. Lionel's mouth twitched. What are you implying? Poirot ignored the question. Where were you at 8 o'clock yesterday morning? In bed, Lionel answered. I sleep in. Everyone knows that. Can anyone confirm? No, he admitted. But I had no reason to kill the man. He wasn't disinheriting Cecilia, was he? Poirot made no reply. Alan Venn, the pianist, brought a colder air with him. He was dressed immaculately in a plum-colored jacket, and his voice carried the effortless arrogance of someone used to applause. I arrived late the evening before, he said. Around 9. The Colonel had already begun his speech. I didn't think he'd notice. You were not expected? Oh, no, I was invited, Venn replied, lounging back in the chair. But not wanted. I was Randolph Fairfax's godson, you see, a little relic from the past. Poirot raised a brow. The Colonel's brother. Indeed, dead these 20 years. But the Colonel never quite forgave me for existing, I think. I reminded him too much of things he buried. And why did you come? Venn's smile was tight. Curiosity. Vindication. I wanted to see how old men rot. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Were you near the breakfast room yesterday morning? No, I was in the conservatory. Playing scales. You can ask Iris, the maid. She brought me tea. Poirot made a note, even as a suspicion unfolded. Quiet and shapeless. Beatrice Whodunit declined to sit. I'll stand, she said. I dislike being examined. You knew the Colonel best, perhaps, Poirot said, aside from Dr. Hollings. He was a fool, but a deliberate one, always pretending not to see what he did. What do you mean? He knew the family hated him. He encouraged it, but I saw through it. You are not in the will. Beatrice smirked. Oh, no, I'm the inconvenient goddaughter, the family's secret. The guilt made flesh. You are bitter. Of course, she said plainly, but not murderous. Poirot gave a slight bow. And where were you yesterday morning? In the library, writing a letter. You may ask Bickley. He delivered it to the post. Dr. Hollings and Bickley gave little. The doctor confirmed the time of death as likely between 7:30 and 8:30. The butler insisted he had seen no one enter the breakfast room before Mrs. Fallon found the body. And yet, Poirot was unsatisfied. Too many statements overlapped, yet no alibis truly crossed. Every person had been alone. He stood once more in the breakfast room as the day dwindled, eyes fixed on the unremarkable glass, now emptied and sealed in a police bag. The crime had no noise, no mess, no struggle. But Poirot knew. It had purpose, and the person who staged this had not acted in haste. They had planned the image. He turned slowly and murmured, "Someone here is not who they pretend to be." Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. Though Poirot had already arrived at Windward Grange in the physical sense, it was not until later that afternoon, after the interviews had concluded and the fog thickened like a curtain, that he truly made his entrance. He waited until the household had gathered again, reluctantly, in the drawing-room. They sat as if compelled by a shared sense of unease, an unspoken pressure to remain in one another's sight. Tea had been laid out by Iris, but it was mostly untouched. The fireplace crackled gently, unable to warm the space between them. Poirot entered last. His silhouette framed by the heavy oak door, he stepped in with the careful elegance of a man rehearsed in stagecraft and observation. He paused at the threshold, not for effect, but because he was measuring them again. Who looked up? Who avoided his gaze? Who had changed their seat from the night before? "Mes amis," he began, moving to the hearth with practiced leisure. "I thank you for your patience. It is never pleasant, n'est-ce pas, to be under scrutiny, but I ask for a little more." He clasped his hands before him, nodding courteously to each guest. "I've spoken with all of you. I've examined the scene. I've drunk the tea, inspected the linen, and wandered the halls, and already I see there is a performance happening here. But I wonder, who is the playwright?" Cecilia frowned. "You mean one of us staged it?" Poirot turned toward her with a mild smile. "But of course, do you not see, mademoiselle? This crime, it is too neat, too artful. A man sits dead, untouched, a glass full of crimson liquid before him. It is not a crime of rage. It is not even a crime of opportunity." He raised a finger. "No, it is a message." Alan Venn laughed, though it carried no mirth. "A message to whom?" Poirot regarded him carefully. "That, monsieur, is precisely the question. Was it meant for the household, for the deceased, for someone long dead, or perhaps for someone watching from the shadows?" There was a rustle of discomfort, the scrape of a cup placed too quickly upon its saucer. Poirot continued, softer now. "Consider, if you will, the peculiarities. The colonel was found at his place, his food untouched, his routine uninterrupted. The glass, distinctive and specific, was filled with something not meant to be consumed. And above him, the stained glass that cast a bloody glow." He pointed to the far wall where the afternoon sun, diluted by fog, filtered through just such a window, now more pink than red. "Tell me," Poirot said, looking at Beatrice, "did he often sit in this exact spot?" Beatrice nodded slowly. "Every morning. He liked the view." "And was it common knowledge how the light hit the room?" She hesitated. "Among the household, yes. He used to say the sun was his second clock." Poirot turned then to Calthorne, who had taken a quiet place near the doorway. "Inspector, did you notice the letter left in the study? The cryptic one? The past bleeds through?" "Just so. Combined with the ring from his dead brother's effects, and the presence of young Venn, also tied to that brother's memory. One wonders." Lionel folded his arms. "You're saying this has something to do with Randolph?" "I say," replied Poirot gently, "that the dead have a way of speaking through the living." As the clock struck 5, Poirot took to the garden path outside. The air was heavy with salt and damp pine. He moved slowly, deliberately, past the overgrown hedges and down a stone path that curved toward the cliffside. Bickley had told him earlier that the colonel often walked here in the morning, alone, always before breakfast. The bench at the path's end bore the signs of long use, worn smooth along the armrests, with a blanket still folded beneath it. Poirot sat. From here, the house loomed behind him, and the sea stretched endlessly ahead. He drew a small notebook from his pocket and opened it. On the top of the page he wrote, 1. The colonel knew something. 2. The killer needed it silenced elegantly. 3. The glass or Proman message. But why blood if no blood was shed? Poirot tapped the pencil to his chin. Then he wrote a 4th line, underlined, "Who benefits if the colonel dies quietly?" The wind picked up slightly. Somewhere far below, the gulls screamed their verdicts over the waves. He closed the notebook and stood. Back in the drawing room, the guests had dispersed, but one remained. Iris, the maid, standing beside the tea service, gathering cups. Poirot approached her gently. "Mademoiselle," he said softly, You brought Mr. Venn tea yesterday morning. She nodded. In the conservatory? Yes. And did you also set the breakfast table for the Colonel? Her eyes darted slightly. Yes, I always do. Before I took Mr. Venn his tray. Did anything seem out of place? She swallowed. The glass was already there. Usually I lay it myself, but it was already set. Already filled? No, she said. Just placed. But it struck me. He's particular about that. I assumed Bickley had done it. Poirot's eyes glimmered. Merci, Iris. That is most illuminating. Someone had chosen the glass for the Colonel, and someone else, perhaps, had waited for the light to strike it red. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The next morning dawned grey again, though a lighter shade. Fog now more gauze than shroud. The house, however, remained heavy. Poirot, ever punctual, took breakfast in the library, not the dining room. He did not trust places that had been staged. He preferred the corners where truths clung quietly. At precisely 10 o'clock, he began what he referred to, with his customary fastidiousness, as le véritable commencement, the true beginning. I will see the guests again, he told Inspector Calthorne. But this time, we will speak not only of the Colonel's death, but of what they wished to hide. Calthorne gave a tight nod and stationed himself behind a small desk. Shall I record the statements? Poirot waved a hand delicately. No. I prefer the spoken word to travel undisturbed. A transcript, it is like a photograph. It captures the shape, but not the soul. Beatrice Whodunit returned first. She looked, if anything, sharper in the morning light. Her black dress pressed, her gaze cool. You asked yesterday if I was bitter, she began before Poirot could speak. Let me be clearer. I am furious. Poirot inclined his head. At whom, Mademoiselle Whodunit? At the family, she said. At what they buried. At the men who thought silence a virtue. You refer to the Colonel? Yes. And his brother. Poirot leaned forward. Tell me what you know of Randolph Fairfax. He was the bright one, she said, voice tightening. The heir, the scholar, the soldier, until he came back from the front. Damaged. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Shell shock? Worse, she whispered. He was erratic, unstable. The family locked him away, quietly. They called it treatment. It was exile. Poirot's voice softened. And when he died? No one visited. No one claimed the body for days. She looked away. The Colonel never forgave himself, but instead of remorse, he built rules, controlled everything, even me. You were close with Randolph? Beatrice didn't answer immediately. Then, with quiet finality, she said, He left me his journals. I still have them. Poirot did not press. He only said, May I see them? Perhaps, she murmured, if you give me a reason. Alan Venn entered next with the composure of someone used to interrogations, even if they were veiled in velvet. Charming company this morning, he quipped, settling easily into the chair. Poirot ignored the tone. Monsieur Venn, you have been described as something of a family shadow. Would you agree? I suppose so. I linger, but I am not welcome. And yet you attended the Colonel's birthday. Venn smiled thinly. Invitation doesn't always imply warmth. He wrote, You may come if you wish. It would be good for the others to remember. That was all. Remember what, monsieur? Venn's face darkened. That Randolph existed, that not all ghosts stay buried. Poirot let that sit a moment. You said you played piano in the conservatory that morning? Correct. And Iris, the maid, brought your tea? Yes. She was surprised I was up so early. Poirot tilted his head. Why were you? Venn hesitated. Insomnia. The sea wind, perhaps. Or nerves? Venn chuckled, but it rang hollow. I don't get nervous, Monsieur Poirot. I get even. Poirot noted the change in temperature. Did you speak with the Colonel privately at all the night before? I tried. He brushed me off. Said the past had no place in his house. Poirot's eyes glinted. And yet the next morning, he is found dead, with a symbol of the past on his desk, and a red glassed window framing him like an icon. Venn did not reply. He simply stood, nodded stiffly, and left. Cecilia Fairfax arrived last. She looked drawn, as though her sleep had been repeatedly disturbed. Poirot offered her a seat with unexpected gentleness. "Miss Fairfax," he said, "I must ask you difficult things. You understand, yes?" She nodded. "Yes. You lived here. You observed the household closely. You were, in many ways, the Colonel's ward." "Prisoner," she corrected softly. "I wasn't allowed to live anywhere else." "Why?" "He said I owed it to the family, that I had to uphold the name. That my father, his cousin, was a disgrace." "And was he?" She hesitated. "He died of drink. Left debts. The Colonel took me in as an obligation." Poirot observed her closely. "Tell me, did he ever threaten to disinherit you?" Her lips parted. "Not directly, but 2 weeks ago he said something strange." "What was it?" "He said, 'There are things worse than losing money, Cecilia. There's losing silence.'" Poirot sat back, expression unreadable. "And did you understand him?" "No, but he was frightened." After she left, Poirot remained seated for several long minutes. Then he turned to Calthorne. "They are all afraid of the same thing, Inspector." Calthorne frowned. "What's that?" Poirot stood, adjusting his cuffs. "The truth." Later that afternoon, a storm gathered faintly on the horizon. Windward Grange creaked as the light changed once more. Poirot stood at the landing again, staring down at the stained glass panel as the red returned with the sun's low arc. A message. A symbol. A reckoning. He whispered aloud. So then, who wanted the Colonel to die seen? Chapter 6. First false lead. The storm that had threatened all morning broke at last by late afternoon, turning the sky to lead and striking the windows with wind-blown rain. The guests, confined again indoors, moved with the careful inertia of people under observation. There were no card games, no music from the parlor. Only the ceaseless hush of wet weather and the occasional clink of teacups set down with more force than necessary. Poirot did not waste the moment. At precisely 4 o'clock, he asked to see the Colonel's bedroom. Inspector Calthorne looked surprised. The bedroom? He died downstairs. Just so, Poirot murmured. But he did not live downstairs, and men, even tyrants, hide their truth in the rooms where they are alone. The Colonel's private suite was austere, almost monastic. The furniture, dark and severe. The bed, tightly made with military corners. On the side table, a clock, a silver penknife, and an open volume of poetry, unread, the spine uncreased. Beside it sat an envelope, face down. Poirot lifted it delicately. It was addressed in the Colonel's heavy, slanted hand. To be opened in the event of my death. The seal was broken. Calthorne frowned. "You didn't open this, did you?" Poirot shook his head. "No, I would not." "Which means someone else already has." Inside was a single sheet, the Colonel's writing unmistakable. "If I am gone, know this. I did not go willingly. The danger lies within. You must look to the family. Trust no one. A.F." Poirot handed the note silently to Calthorne. "A staged death," the inspector said. "And now, a staged letter?" "Or a genuine one," Poirot replied softly, "which someone opened and chose not to show us." Calthorne looked grim. "Only the staff have keys to this room." Poirot's eyes narrowed. And only the staff would know which drawers were rarely used. A rapid search followed. In the bottom drawer of a tall boy chest, beneath folded shirts that bore the starch of another decade. They found it. A velvet pouch. Inside, 2 antique rings. One was the signet of Randolph Fairfax. The other, a thinner gold band engraved with initials B.R. F. Poirot, turned them in his gloved fingers. Beatrice Whodunit and Randolph. Calthorne exhaled. So they were involved after all. Poirot nodded slowly. And someone meant to remind the Colonel of it, or to use it. He looked at the clock. Where is Miss Whodunit now? In the library, I believe. Poirot didn't move. Have her brought here. Quietly. Beatrice entered with her usual crispness, but stopped short at the sight of the pouch on the bed. You found them, she said softly. Poirot studied her. You knew they were hidden. I suspected. You were going to tell me. I was waiting, she replied, to see if you'd earn it. Poirot inclined his head. And the letter? Her brow furrowed. What letter? He held it out. She read it once, then again, her face draining of color. This isn't his style. He wouldn't say something so dramatic. It is his hand. Yes, but... She paused. Something about it feels wrong. He never called himself A.F., not in writing. Ever. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Then you believe it is a forgery? Or a copy, she said. From an old draft, maybe. But not what he wrote last. Poirot turned the page over. There was no watermark. The edges were slightly torn. Taken from another sheet, he murmured, and repurposed, which means someone wanted us to find this now. Calthorne folded his arms. It implicates the family, almost too cleanly. Poirot nodded. Just so. That evening, after dinner, which was quiet, somber, and barely touched, Poirot called for an informal gathering in the conservatory. They came reluctantly, each suspect drawn like a moth to the glow of accusation. Rain tapped the glass ceiling overhead, a sound like a ticking clock. Poirot stood by the tall fern near the piano. I must inform you, he said gently, that we have found a letter from the late Colonel, a warning perhaps, or a lie. It names no one, but it speaks of betrayal. A ripple passed through the group. And we have also found a ring, he continued, a token of love, hidden away, a symbol of something long kept secret. His gaze landed briefly on Beatrice. She neither flinched nor denied it. And now, Poirot said, lifting the envelope, this has been added to the game. Cecilia leaned forward. Who would forge something like that? Lionel answered before he could stop himself. Someone with motive. Poirot smiled faintly. Indeed, monsieur. But tell me, what motive would one need to invent a warning letter? Alan Venn crossed his arms. To shift suspicion, to frame someone. Precisely, Poirot said. He held the letter over the lamp, examining the ink as it warmed. No smudge, no haste. It was written with calculation. There was a pause. Then Beatrice spoke, her voice steady. You think someone forged a dead man's warning to make it look like the family had something to hide? Poirot met her eyes. I think someone wanted us to believe the family held the guilt. Calthorne shifted. Then the murderer isn't from the family. Poirot's voice dropped. I did not say that, mon ami. I said the murderer wants us to believe they are. He looked at each face in turn. And for a moment, almost, I did. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The next morning brought a deceptive stillness, as if Windward Grange had tired of its own secrets and wished to sleep again. But Poirot was already awake, dressed in a dove-grey suit and seated in the drawing-room by 7. He did not pace nor fidget. He waited. Stillness, he knew, was not inactivity. It was invitation. If one listened carefully, people always stepped forward to fill silence with their own noise. By mid-morning, his patience bore fruit. Alan Venn appeared first, drawn perhaps by boredom or guilt or something in between. He wandered in carrying a cigarette between 2 fingers, though he didn't smoke it. You start early, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot glanced at him. I find people speak more freely before lunch. The appetite sharpens thought. Venn smirked. Or dulls caution. Perhaps both. There was a pause before Poirot continued, casually. Tell me, Monsieur Venn, have you ever forged handwriting? The pianist stopped short. What a strange question. But not a denial. Venn narrowed his eyes. I took calligraphy at school. Piano taught me precision. I could forge a signature, sure. Why? Poirot tilted his head. Only curious. The letter from the colonel, you see, it was not entirely authentic, and someone placed it precisely where we would find it, just after the body was removed, just before the will could be examined. Venn didn't blink. Convenient timing. Too convenient, Poirot said softly. Venn leaned forward, suddenly serious. You think I forged it? Poirot shrugged. I think someone did. And someone who understands rhythm, of music, of timing, of drama, might appreciate the staging of a glass filled with blood beneath a red window. Venn's jaw tightened. If I killed the colonel, I wouldn't make a theatre of it. Poirot offered a gentle smile. Oh, but that is precisely what you would do. Poirot let him leave then, rattled but controlled. Venn would not break with pressure. He would crack in silence. That was the type. Next, Poirot found Cecilia Fairfax alone in the library, rearranging books with no real purpose. You are troubled, mademoiselle, he said, not unkindly. She looked up. Why wouldn't I be? You fear you are being watched. I am being watched. We, but not by me. She said nothing. Poirot moved closer. The colonel. He once punished you for trying to leave, did he not? Her mouth parted slightly. Who told you? No one, Poirot said. But your eyes did. And the bruises were not visible. Emotional injuries rarely are. She turned away. He locked me out of the will once. I found out by accident. Then months later he reversed it. You remained despite that. Because I had nowhere else. Poirot nodded. And now he is dead and your position changes. Cecilia looked at him, her eyes wet but defiant. Are you accusing me? No, mademoiselle, I'm listening, because someone wants very much for me to accuse you. She blinked. What? The letter, Poirot said. It blames the family. But only one person in the family stood to gain both financially and symbolically from the colonel's death. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Me. He nodded once. And I think you are clever enough to know that makes you a perfect target. Cecilia folded her arms across her chest. I didn't forge anything. I didn't touch that glass. Poirot turned. Not touching is precisely the point. The glass was clean. Too clean. As though someone had handled it only with gloves. Or not at all. Before lunch, Poirot made one final visit. This time to Bickley, the butler. The man met him in the servants' hall, polishing silver with unnerving precision. Monsieur Poirot, he said without looking up. Tell me, Bickley, Poirot began gently, when you set the colonel's breakfast table the morning of his death, did you place the glass? Bickley didn't stop his work. No, it was already there. You found that strange? Immensely, but I do not question upstairs choices. You do notice them, though. Bickley finally set down the silver. Yes, and I noticed something else. Poirot waited. Iris, the maid. She seemed shaken before she found the body. Poirot frowned. You saw her. She came down from the east wing, quickly. I asked if she was well. She said she'd heard a noise. What kind of noise? Bickley looked up. She didn't say. Poirot nodded once. Merci, Bickley. That may help more than you know. That evening, Poirot stood again at the threshold of the breakfast room, alone. The light through the stained glass was waning, dimmed by clouds, but still faintly red. He placed a matching glass on the table, filled it halfway with water, stepped back and waited. As the light hit, the glass glowed pink, not red. He replaced it with another, then another, until at last he found the one, the original. A particular crystal, cut at a different angle, sharper facets. When light struck it, it bled color. He stared at the glow, quiet as breath. Then, softly, it was never about the blood. The room held its silence. It was about what it looked like, and who would see it. The trap had been laid, but not for the colonel. No, someone else had been meant to sit there, which meant the wrong person had died. Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. Rain returned with a whisper after midnight, and Windward Grange groaned beneath it. The old roof gathered water in quiet hollows, and the walls seemed to exhale unease. Poirot did not sleep. He sat at the edge of his guest bed with a blanket folded over his knees, hands resting like statues, mind turning in deliberate spirals. The colonel had not been the intended target. That changed everything, and nothing. It did not absolve the household. It deepened the deception. If someone had meant to kill another, they had still killed someone, and worse, they had killed the wrong man. By dawn, he had made his decision. It was time to stir the waters. The household awoke to commotion. Iris, the maid, pale and trembling, had burst into the morning room with a letter in her hand, and panic stitched across her voice. "This was outside Miss Fairfax's door," she gasped. "Folded under the mat. I saw the edge of it and picked it up. I didn't know." Poirot took the paper from her gently. It was folded thrice and sealed with wax. No monogram, no name. Inside, a single line. "If you sit where he sat, you will meet the same end." Cecilia, upon hearing it read aloud, turned a shade paler and gripped the edge of the settee. Who would send that to me?" Poirot offered no immediate answer. He read the line again, lips moving silently. Inspector Calthorne, summoned hastily, frowned at the letter. "It's a threat. Plain as day." Poirot shook his head. "No, mon ami. It is not a threat. It is a correction." "A correction?" "Yes. Someone wants Miss Fairfax to know she was the intended victim, not the colonel." The room hushed around them. "But why admit that now?" Beatrice asked, eyes narrowed. Poirot nodded slowly. "To cause fear. Guilt. Or perhaps to give her a chance to run." Lionel Grange stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "No one's leaving?" Poirot's voice was calm. "No, monsieur. Not yet." Later that morning, while the house hummed with restrained speculation, Poirot asked to speak again with Dr. Hollings, the family physician. They met in the library, the air thick with dust and expectation. "You've known the Fairfax family long?" Poirot began. 20 years. I treated the colonel, and Randolph before him." "And Miss Fairfax?" "Since childhood. She suffers from insomnia, tension. She internalizes things." Poirot nodded. "You once prescribed her something to help her sleep, did you not?" The doctor blinked. "Yes. Diazine, a mild sedative." Poirot leaned in. "Could such a drug, if altered or combined, be dangerous?" "Not on its own, but yes, in certain combinations. It could suppress respiration, especially in someone with a heart condition." Poirot smiled faintly. "And did the colonel have such a condition?" "No. His health was unremarkable for a man his age. And yet he died, without struggle, without pain." The doctor's expression darkened. "You think someone slipped him something?" "I think," Poirot said quietly, "someone prepared a chair, a breakfast, a place for someone else, and fate or routine placed the wrong person there." Dr. Hollings rubbed his temple. "Then whoever wrote that letter this morning, they realized the error." "Or," Poirot said, "they wanted us to." By midday, a new revelation surfaced. The Colonel's solicitor arrived, summoned by Calthorne to retrieve the original will and confirm its contents. But when he opened the envelope sealed in the desk, he frowned. "This is not the will," he said. "It's a decoy. The real one was signed 3 weeks ago, filed with my office. And it is different." "Different how?" Calthorne asked. "Most notably, it removes Miss Fairfax entirely and names a new heir." A pause. "Mr. Lionel Grange." The room turned. Cecilia, too stunned to speak, pressed a hand to her mouth. Lionel took a step backward. That can't be right." The solicitor nodded gravely. The Colonel was quite firm. He said he had come to question his niece's judgment. Poirot asked, "And who witnessed this revision?" "The housekeeper and the butler. Standard procedure." The Colonel was clear, lucid, and insistent. Poirot murmured. "Then the motive has shifted again." Calthorne looked grim. "And the field narrowed." Poirot shook his head. "Not narrowed. Obscured." He turned to Cecilia, who stood rooted in place. "Did you know?" "No," she whispered. He never said a word. Poirot turned next to Lionel. "And you?" Lionel's voice cracked. "No, I didn't even want it. He hated me. He said I was useless." Poirot did not reply. He simply stared at the two of them, one disinherited, one newly enriched, and said nothing, but the letter still bothered him. It was too tidy, too opportune. Poirot took it again to the window. He studied the ink, smelled it, rubbed a finger lightly across its surface. Then he smiled, faintly, for it was not ink. It was pigment from a specific pencil, a type used only by artists, and only one guest had brought a case of them. He turned, eyes sharp, voice like silk drawn across a blade. "Find Mr. Venn." The message had been written not to warn, but to frame. Someone wanted Cecilia to believe she was the intended victim, but the real game was still deeper, and the past still not done bleeding through. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. Poirot stood beneath the great portrait of Randolph Fairfax in the upstairs corridor, hands behind his back, gaze fixed not on the eyes of the long-dead heir, but on the painted ring, a thick gold band prominent on Randolph's finger, identical to the one found in the pouch. Beatrice's initials etched within. Hidden things, he thought, rarely remain so for long. A rustle behind him. "I hear you've been asking about me." Alan Venn leaned against the banister, arms folded, a worn leather artist's case slung under one arm. His usual smoothness had a frayed edge now, something tugging at the composure. Poirot turned slowly. "Ah, monsieur, I was hoping we might speak." "About?" Poirot gestured lightly. "Your pencils. The kind used by illustrators. Rare pigment. Difficult to come by outside certain circles." Venn didn't move. "You think I wrote the letter?" "I know you did." The silence between them stretched long and thin. Then Venn gave a sharp smile. "I wanted to protect her." "Protect whom?" "Cecilia. I saw her unraveling. After the Colonel died, after all the tension and speculation, she was breaking apart. I thought if I made it look like she was the target, rather than the suspect, she might stop waiting for the axe to fall." Poirot watched him quietly. "But, monsieur, when one shifts suspicion, one also risks misdirection becoming permanent. You could have implicated her further." Venn's jaw tensed. "Maybe. But she's innocent? And you know this? How?" "I know people," he said flatly. "I watched her for years. She couldn't hurt a spider." Poirot said nothing. He turned back to the portrait of Randolph. Venn followed his gaze. "You think this has something to do with Randolph, don't you?" "I think," Poirot replied softly, "that his ghost is more active in this house than any living man." Later that day, Poirot asked Beatrice Whodunit to join him in the Colonel's study. The room had not changed, still dark, still watchful. "Miss Whodunit," Poirot began, "did you know Mr. Venn was once considered heir to Randolph Fairfax's estate?" She looked up sharply. "No, that can't be." "Ah, but it is. The Colonel mentioned it in a letter I discovered tucked into one of the ledgers. Randolph never formalized it, but there was an intention." Beatrice's voice was brittle. "That would mean Alan inherited?" "Nothing," Poirot interrupted. "Because the Colonel suppressed the arrangement, quietly, legally, but he could not suppress the memory." She turned away, a tremor in her hands. "He hated Alan," she murmured. "Told me once that the boy was a mirror he didn't want hanging on the wall." Poirot inclined his head. He represented what Randolph left behind, and perhaps what the Colonel envied. Beatrice looked at him. "Envy?" Poirot's voice dropped. Randolph was the favorite, the brilliant one, the one remembered. Arundel Fairfax merely endured. She sat heavily in the leather armchair. "You think he punished the rest of us for it? I think he buried the past under stone, and someone has begun chiseling it loose." At dusk, Poirot returned to the breakfast room, alone again. He stood before the window as the last of the red light faded. The table was bare now, stripped of its theatrics, but Poirot was no longer interested in the blood-colored glass. His attention turned to the floor, where faint scuff marks near the chair legs suggested something had been moved. He knelt, inspected them. The chair had been shifted slightly, then returned. Not by someone fleeing in haste, but by someone precise, someone rehearsing. He stood, lips pressed tight. That evening he called for Iris, the maid. She came quickly, wringing her hands in her apron. "Please, monsieur, I've told you everything." Poirot held up a hand. "Only one question, mademoiselle. On the morning of the Colonel's death, were any of the rooms locked?" She blinked. "Locked?" "Yes. Perhaps the conservatory, or one of the guest suites." Iris frowned. "Well, the east corridor had its doors shut, but it sticks when it rains, not locked, just stiff." Poirot nodded slowly. "And who sleeps in that wing?" Well, Miss Whodunit and Mr. Venn. They're opposite each other." Poirot looked down. "And who rose first that morning?" I don't know. I didn't see either of them until after." "You heard a sound, though." She hesitated. A thump, like a chair moving, or someone dropping something. It came from Mr. Venn's room. Poirot's voice was calm. "And did you tell the inspector this?" She looked frightened. "No, I didn't want to make trouble." Poirot smiled kindly. "You have helped more than you know." That night, alone in his guest room, Poirot placed 4 photographs on the desk. Randolph, the Colonel, Beatrice, Venn. He added Cecilia's image last, snipped from a group portrait. Her eyes were turned away from the camera, the only one not looking forward. He stared at the arrangement, then picked up a pen. In the center of the paper he wrote, "Who fears the truth most?" and beneath it, "Who needs it most to stay hidden?" The connections were forming, not of crime yet, but of desperation. This was no simple murder. This was an old wound reopened, and someone would do anything to keep it from scarring over. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The morning broke in silence, not even the gulls daring to cry above the cliffs. Windward Grange stood still beneath a heavy sky, a house exhausted from its own secrets, and in the small study just off the east wing, Hercule Poirot sat motionless before a pair of envelopes. One was the forged letter, written in deliberate script, sealed with common wax, its threat directed at Cecilia Fairfax. The other was the envelope the Colonel had left marked, "To be opened in the event of my death." Though the contents were now known to Poirot, it was not the words inside that captured his attention. It was the paper, Same cut, same faint grain, same subtle watermark. A crowned lion, barely visible under angled light. The two envelopes had come from the same stationery box. Not just the same brand, the same source. Poirot allowed himself the smallest of nods. He retrieved the velvet pouch once more from his satchel. The rings were inside. The one belonging to Randolph, thick, signet-marked, had a faint discoloration near the interior curve. Poirot held it beneath his lamp and tilted it. A trace of something reddish. Not blood, not rust. Pigment. He dipped the tip of a moistened cloth and drew it across the stain. A red smear lifted cleanly into the fabric. His eyes narrowed. It was the same pigment from the forged letter. The ring, the letter, the paper, all had passed through the same hands. Poirot folded the cloth and tucked it away. He would not yet reveal what he knew. Timing was everything. Downstairs, the house stirred in fragments. Lionel Grange was seen in the billiards room, flicking at a cue stick with no intention of playing. Cecilia sat in the window bay with a shawl pulled close, eyes vacant. Beatrice paced along the hallway near the solarium, and Alan Venn had disappeared entirely for the better part of 2 hours. Poirot took tea alone in the library, then summoned Inspector Calthorne. "I require a list," he said simply, "of all items taken from the Colonel's pockets and any keys known to be missing." Calthorne blinked. "Missing?" "Yes," Poirot said. "There is a drawer in the Colonel's desk, small, left side, concealed behind a false panel. It was locked." "I wasn't aware of it." "Because you didn't know to look." Poirot offered the faintest smile. "But I did." Calthorne returned less than an hour later with a slip of paper. 2 keys were found on the Colonel. House key. Study cabinet. But the old servants say he kept a third. Thin brass. Shaped like a skeleton key. It's gone. Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And the contents of his pockets?" Calthorne read, "Handkerchief, money clip, folded program from the birthday evening, and a matchbox." "Matchbox?" "Empty. From the Elgin, an old hotel in London." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "I know it," he said softly. "Randolph once stayed there. It was mentioned in his obituary." Coincidence? Or a message? Poirot returned to the Colonel's study. He had kept the broken sealed letter in a drawer, but now he retrieved it again. Not the words. He had no further interest in the contents. It was the way the flap had been opened. Carefully, with a slim blade. Not torn. He searched the desk, and there it was. A letter opener, bone-handled, sharp as a scalpel, but with a trace of red on its tip. The same pigment. Someone had opened the Colonel's private envelope before the police arrived, and used his own letter opener to do it. Poirot did not smile. He folded the letter once more and returned it to its drawer. That evening, he requested a quiet walk with Cecilia just beyond the rose arbor where the mist collected at the roots. She accepted without speaking. They walked slowly, Poirot deliberately shortening his stride. "Miss Fairfax," he said gently, "did your uncle ever speak of regret?" She turned to him. "Often, but only abstractly." "What did he fear most, do you think?" She frowned. "Exposure, weakness, not being in control." Poirot nodded. "And did he ever speak of your father?" Her step faltered. "Only once. He said he pitied him." Because he loved without permission," she whispered. Poirot stopped walking. "Miss Fairfax," he said, "did your father and Beatrice Whodunit ever?" Cecilia looked away. "They were inseparable once, when I was a child. But the Colonel ended it. He said it was indecent, that she was beneath him." Poirot's expression did not change, but his thoughts swirled. Beatrice and Cecilia's father, Randolph and Beatrice. 2 men, 1 woman, 1 family. Too many threads left hanging. That night, as the storm returned with low thunder, Poirot wrote one more note to himself. He circled 3 names: Beatrice, Randolph, Cecilia's father, and beside it a single line. What if the heir was never meant to be known? A secret child? A hidden inheritance? Not murder for money, but for memory, and someone had started to unbury it. Someone who couldn't afford for the truth to come to light. Poirot placed the note in his pocket. Tomorrow he would ask Beatrice one final question, and it would not be about the past, but about what she was protecting in the present. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. The house woke late. The storm had rattled windows deep into the night, and by morning the halls of Windward Grange were filled not with the smell of breakfast, but with silence and dust motes, neither of which had settled. Poirot, punctual as ever, was already dressed and seated near the grand staircase, a pocket notebook in hand, and his gaze turned, not inward but outward, toward the converging lines of a crisis. The suspects had begun to turn on one another. It started with a sharp remark over tea. Beatrice had said nothing out of the ordinary, only that some people had a strange relationship with inheritance. Lionel, sitting nearby, reacted first. "You mean me, of course," he muttered. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "I don't know, do I?" Lionel stood abruptly. "You think I knew about the will, that I killed the colonel to speed along my fortune?" Beatrice's voice was cold. "Didn't you?" Poirot observed them both without blinking. "This is most illuminating." Cecilia, seated at the window, rose suddenly. "Enough," she snapped. "If you're going to accuse each other like frightened children, do it in the garden where the staff doesn't have to hear it." Beatrice's eyes narrowed. He stood to gain the most. "And yet," Lionel shot back, "I didn't know that until after the man was dead. How convenient, Miss Rowden, that you know so much about so many things." "Perhaps," Beatrice replied icily, "because I'm the only one who remembers." Poirot held up a hand. "There is truth in memory, yes," he said gently. "But memory is also a mirror. It reflects only what we wish to see. The colonel is dead, but the motive for his death may lie not in his future, but in his past." Later, Poirot requested to speak to Beatrice privately, this time not in the study, but in the small stone gazebo that overlooked the east garden. Rain had left the stone slick, and ivy curled around the posts like quiet witnesses. Beatrice joined him, gloved hands clasped before her. "You wish to speak of Randolph," she said. Poirot nodded. "Yes, but also of someone else. Cecilia's father." She turned away. Poirot continued gently. "You knew both brothers, and you loved one, but you were also close with the other." Beatrice's breath caught. "I loved Randolph," she said. "But your mind is not wrong, Monsieur Poirot. There was affection, deep affection, for Adrian Fairfax as well." "Adrian," Poirot echoed, "the colonel's cousin, Cecilia's father." "He was the kindest of them," she murmured. "Not brilliant like Randolph, not cold like Arundel, just human." Poirot watched her face carefully. "Was there a child?" Beatrice turned sharply. "You think Cecilia is—" "No, no," he said. "Not Cecilia." Silence stretched between them. Then she sat. "There was a child," she whispered. "Randolph's. Mine, a boy. Born in secret after the war." Poirot's brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. "He was taken from me," she said. "Randolph was dead. The colonel arranged everything. I was told the boy died at birth, but I never saw a body." Poirot's voice was quiet. "You believe he lived?" "I don't know what to believe," she said, "but I received letters. Once a year. No return address. No name. Just a drawing. A child's hand at first, then a young man's, always the same signature." Ah, Poirot repeated. "For Randolph." "Or for the boy," she said. "I never told anyone. The colonel swore me to silence. Poirot's eyes flickered. "You were protecting someone." "Yes," she said, "and perhaps damning someone else." That afternoon, the guests avoided one another. Lionel took long walks in the rain without coat or direction. Cecilia read without turning pages. Venn locked himself in the music room. Beatrice retired to her chamber and did not answer knocks. Poirot allowed the tension to grow. Like steam in a closed kettle, pressure would reveal the fault lines. By early evening, he requested that the entire household gather in the drawing room. The staff lingered at the edges. The suspects sat in their usual pattern, though now with wider gaps between chairs. Poirot stood near the fireplace, hands folded, tone calm. "Someone among us," he said, "has lived their life beneath a name that does not belong to them. Someone was born of a secret, shaped by silence and shielded by fear." A flicker across the room, Venn shifting in his chair. Cecilia's hands tightening, Beatrice very still. "And someone," Poirot continued, "killed a man by mistake, believing they were ending the one who posed a threat to that secret." Calthorne, standing by the door, cleared his throat. "You believe the intended victim was not the colonel?" Poirot nodded. "Yes. And I now believe the original target was Cecilia." Gasps. Lionel rose half from his chair, aghast. "She was meant to die," Poirot said gently, "because she knew too little, but had begun to ask too much. The colonel, by sheer force of routine, sat in her place, a mistake that exposed everything." "But who?" Beatrice whispered. "Who would do that?" Poirot looked at them all. "I will tell you tomorrow," he said. "For tonight, let the silence sit. Let the house remember what it buried." He turned to go, then paused. "But I tell you this. One of you is not who you say you are. And before this ends, that name will be spoken aloud." Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The rain did not return that night, but the silence it left behind was thicker than weather. Windward Grange held its breath. Footsteps were softer, glances sharper. Poirot, knowing the pressure had reached its peak, chose not to speak again until morning. He wandered the halls, not aimlessly, but with the keen instinct of a man tracing fear by its echo. He visited each wing, listened to each door, measured each stillness. At dawn, the house felt on the verge of confession, and so at breakfast, Poirot struck. He entered the dining room precisely at 8. The table was set again, by his request. No one sat yet, but the chairs were waiting, the room prepared like a stage. He turned to Iris, the maid. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he said. "Now, please send for Mr. Venn." Alan Venn entered 5 minutes later, still buttoning his jacket, hair damp from a hasty wash. He paused when he saw the room, saw Poirot seated in the same chair where the colonel had died, now empty of menace but not memory. "You asked for me?" he said slowly. Poirot gestured to the seat opposite him. "Please." Venn sat, watching Poirot with the narrowed eyes of a man who knows the truth is close enough to taste. Poirot poured tea, precisely, quietly. Then he said, "You lied to me." Venn didn't flinch. "You told me you didn't know the colonel had revised the will," Poirot continued. "But you did. You knew he had changed it to name Lionel as heir, because you saw the letter yourself when you broke into his study the night before he died." Venn exhaled. "I didn't kill him." "I know," Poirot said. Now Venn blinked. "You didn't intend to kill anyone," Poirot continued, "but you discovered something. Perhaps a clue, a letter, something that made you believe Miss Fairfax was in danger, or worse, complicit in something." "I saw the ring," Venn said quietly. "The one with Randolph's initials. Hidden, freshly moved. I thought—" "Yes," Poirot said. "You thought the colonel had been hiding something that might destroy her. Or you. You were trying to uncover it before it surfaced." Venn leaned forward, voice low. "Who is he, Poirot?" Poirot tilted his head. "The child." Poirot's lips pressed together. "That is not the question we must ask now." Venn looked stricken. "Then what is?" "Who knew?" An hour later, Poirot assembled the household in the grand drawing-room. The storm had passed, and the light through the stained glass window no longer bled red. It merely warmed the floor in soft pink. The air was sharp with expectation. Beatrice stood near the piano, a hand pressed to its lid. Cecilia and Lionel sat together, both pale and upright, like statues placed too close. Venn stood apart, arms folded. Calthorne lingered by the mantel, unreadable. Poirot entered last. He stood by the hearth, immaculate in his grey suit, and looked at them each in turn. "This morning," he said, "I had a most illuminating conversation about silence, about secrets, and about what happens when the past is not allowed to die properly." No one moved. Poirot held up a small object. It was the matchbox from the Elgin Hotel. Randolph Fairfax stayed at the Elgin during his final days, and there he wrote 2 letters, one to Beatrice, which was intercepted by the Colonel, and one to his solicitor. That second letter disappeared. Poirot turned slowly, until I found its copy, hidden in a compartment behind the desk drawer. He placed the matchbox down. It names his heir, not Arundel, not Beatrice, but a child. He let the silence stretch. The child was born here, hidden here, raised near the family but not within it. Someone who would inherit everything, if ever they knew to claim it. Cecilia shook her head. "But that can't be." "Who?" Poirot turned to Venn. "You," he said. Alan blinked. "Me?" Poirot nodded. "Randolph's child, taken in by a sympathetic relative of the housekeeper. Given the surname Venn, common, easily dismissed, but always invited to windward, always welcome, but never acknowledged." Beatrice gasped. Poirot turned to her. "You did not know?" She shook her head slowly, hand to her chest. I hoped," she whispered, "but I didn't know." Poirot looked again at Venn. "You were not the murderer, monsieur, but someone feared what your presence would reveal. Someone thought Cecilia was getting too close, that her questions about the family, her insistence on truth, would lead directly to you." Poirot stepped forward. "And so they prepared a scene, a symbolic execution, meant for her. But the Colonel, by routine and pride, sat in her chair. He drank the tainted tea. He died instead." Beatrice's voice cracked. "But who did it?" Poirot turned to the last figure in the room, Calthorne. The inspector blinked. "What?" Poirot's voice was soft. "You were the one who arrived first, who declared the death suspicious before a doctor had examined the body. You found the letter, but you had already opened it. You accessed the study before anyone else." Calthorne's face drained of color. You think I poisoned him?" "I think," Poirot said, "you switched the tea. You prepared the table. You placed the glass. You made it look like a theatrical suicide, but only after realizing the Colonel had died in Cecilia's place." Poirot paused. "You were her guardian, the Colonel's choice. But you wanted more." Calthorne stepped backward. "No, I protected her." "You wanted the truth buried," Poirot said, "because you were the one who knew it all along." Calthorne turned. Ran. But the constable in the hall had already been warned. The door slammed shut, and the past, finally, had nowhere left to hide. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The sound of the lock sliding home echoed through Windward Grange like the slam of judgment. Calthorne froze mid-turn, one hand still outstretched toward the door, the other clenching nothing but air. The constable stepped forward with the confidence of a man who had been warned. There was no violence, no raised voice, only the slow shrinking of a man who had suddenly realized the walls around him were no longer architectural. They were evidence. Poirot stepped forward. "I would advise you to sit, Inspector," he said calmly. But Calthorne did not. Instead, his eyes scanned the room, landing briefly on Cecilia, on Ven, then finally on Beatrice. Something shifted in his expression, and then he moved, not toward the exit, but toward the staircase. The others shouted as he bolted from the drawing room, feet pounding against the wood floor like an alarm bell. Lionel lunged to follow, but Poirot held up a hand. "Non. Let him go. But he'll get away." "No," Poirot said softly. "He has nowhere left to run." Upstairs, Calthorne moved with surprising speed for a man always perceived as stolid. He reached the Colonel's study, yanked open the desk drawers, and tore through their contents like a man searching for absolution. Papers flew. Letters slid to the floor in curling arcs. Then he found what he sought. A key, small, brass, shaped like a skeleton's spine. He darted to the east wing, to the linen cupboard just beyond the servants' stairs. There, behind the hanging shelf of folded bed-sheets, was a narrow door. Locked. He inserted the key, hands shaking. It turned with a quiet click. Inside, a narrow space, scarcely more than a passage. Dusty, cold, and at the far end, an old chest. He crouched, opened it, and began pulling out its contents. Letters, journals. One wrapped in silk, a sketch of a boy, signed R. He stared at them, breathing hard. Footsteps approached behind him. He turned. Beatrice stood in the doorway, her face unreadable. "You kept them," she said softly. Calthorne's voice was dry. "He gave them to me, all of it. Randolph wanted it buried. Arundel made me promise, made me swear, to keep it sealed." "And now?" she asked. "They would destroy everything. That boy, Ven. He doesn't even know what he is. And Cecilia, if she finds out what her father did, who he was." "She deserves to know," Beatrice said. Calthorne's expression turned desperate. "No, you don't understand. That child, that inheritance, it ruins all of it." Poirot's voice echoed from behind her. "Non, monsieur. It corrects it." Calthorne stiffened. Poirot stepped into the chamber slowly, flanked by the constable. "You thought you were protecting the house, but in truth you were preserving a lie you no longer controlled." Calthorne's breath came in ragged pulls. "You don't understand." "Oh, but I do," Poirot said gently. "You are not trying to murder the Colonel. You were trying to silence Cecilia, to frighten her into retreat. You switched the teacup, filled the crystal glass with that symbolic red mixture. You knew she would sit in her usual seat. But the Colonel sat first." Calthorne dropped the bundle in his hands. Papers fanned out across the floor. "I couldn't let it all unravel." Poirot knelt and picked up one sheet, a letter in Randolph's hand, written to Beatrice. "If the boy grows, let him grow in light, not under their name, but in his own." Poirot stood slowly. "You could have honored this," he said. "Instead, you twisted it." Beatrice stepped forward, quiet now, and gathered the scattered letters. Her hands did not tremble. "You are never protecting the family," she whispered. "You are preserving yourself." Calthorne did not deny it. He was led from the hidden corridor in silence. Poirot walked behind him, not triumphantly, but with solemn precision. Downstairs, the others waited. Cecilia stood as they entered, eyes wide. Lionel beside her, still pale. Poirot spoke softly. "The man you trusted, your family's so-called protector, was the one who created the illusion of danger. He wished to terrify you into silence." Cecilia's voice cracked. "But why? Because you were asking questions? Because you are your father's daughter?" She looked toward Beatrice, who nodded once. "And Mr. Ven?" she asked. Poirot's voice lowered. "Is Randolph's son, born in secret, raised nearby, hidden by those who thought it better to erase the past than confront it." Ven didn't move, but his face had turned to glass, reflective, unreadable. Poirot faced him. "You were never meant to inherit this mess, monsieur, and yet it may be yours." Venn said nothing. That night the house was quieter than it had ever been. Calthorne sat under watch, awaiting transfer. Beatrice placed the recovered letters into a trunk with her own journals. Venn wandered the upper hall alone. Pausing outside the colonel's bedroom but did not enter, Cecilia stood in the east garden, shawl around her shoulders, breathing the first clean air she had tasted in years. "And Poirot," he wrote. In the end, it was not a crime of greed. It was a crime of preservation, of silencing memory before it could speak. But the past does not disappear. It reflects. Like blood in a glass. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The next morning broke differently. No mist clung to the hedges. No storm hung on the horizon. Windward Grange, for the first time in days, was bathed in early golden light that poured through the upper windows and warmed the old oak floors. The house no longer seemed to sigh beneath the weight of its silence. But the truth, Poirot knew, had not yet been fully laid bare. Calthorne's arrest had removed the immediate threat, but there remained a deeper question, one that had haunted the corners of Poirot's mind since he first entered the breakfast room and saw the red-tinged glass glinting beneath the stained window. Why had the colonel sat in that seat at all? It was not his usual place. He had always preferred the chair opposite, for its view of the garden. And yet that morning he had chosen Cecilia's spot, a fatal choice, but not a random one. Poirot spent the early hours revisiting the colonel's study. Not to search again, but to sit. He examined the room from where the colonel would have sat at his desk. The angles of the bookshelves, the placement of the windows, the feel of the chair beneath him. He opened the side drawer. Inside, the contents remained as before. Stationery, ink, correspondence. Except, Poirot reached toward the very back and ran his fingers along the lining. There was something tucked deep within. A folded card, yellowed at the edges, its corners softened by time. He drew it out carefully. It was a funeral notice, dated nearly 23 years prior. Randolph Fairfax. Died, October 9th, 1919. There was a faint pencil mark on the margin, barely visible. A number. 149. Poirot stared. Not a date. A code. He slipped the card into his pocket and moved to the bookshelf. The colonel had always favored the classics. The third shelf held the Odyssey, Aeneid, and Plutarch's Lives, Volume 1. Poirot pulled it gently from its place and opened to page 49. There, beneath a line in faint pencil, "The wound which cannot be seen is the most fatal." Pressed between the pages, another letter, sealed. Poirot did not open it. Not yet. Instead, he descended to the dining room, where the others had already gathered, summoned by his quiet message. The long table had not been used since the day of the murder. Now it was set once more, not with silverware, but with silence. Cecilia, Lionel, Beatrice, and Venn took their places. Poirot stood. He withdrew the funeral card and held it up. This was hidden in the colonel's desk, a note from Randolph's burial. Beatrice inhaled sharply. Poirot continued, "It contains a number, one that led me to this." He placed the sealed letter on the table. The room tensed. Poirot did not break the wax. Instead, he looked to Beatrice. "This is addressed to you." She stared. He kept it. Yes, hidden, like the ring, like the truth. With trembling hands, Beatrice opened the envelope. Her eyes scanned the page slowly. She made no sound. When she finished, she passed it silently to Cecilia. Poirot watched them both. "It confirms what we now suspect," he said. "That the child born after Randolph's death survived. That he was entrusted, secretly, to the household. that Arundel swore to raise him without name or inheritance. He turned to Venn. You. Venn said nothing. Cecilia's voice broke the silence. So why now? Why all of this now? Poirot's gaze turned solemn. Because the colonel was changing. He had written a new letter to be delivered after his death. Not the decoy we found, but a real one, never posted. He was planning to tell you, Miss Whodunit, and perhaps even Alan himself. Beatrice's voice trembled. Then why did he change the will? Why disinherit Cecilia and name Lionel? Poirot answered gently. To draw out the snake. To provoke action. He had begun to suspect Calthorne. He changed the will knowing someone would act to stop him. And he died for it, Beatrice said softly. No, Poirot corrected. He died because he changed chairs. Because for the first time he chose to sit facing the morning light, just once, to see how it felt. A minor indulgence, a moment of reflection. It cost him his life. He paused. The irony, mes amis, is unbearable. Afterward, Poirot returned to the east garden. The air was still. Bees moved among the roses. The house behind him no longer watched. It simply stood. Venn approached slowly. Poirot didn't turn. You have a choice, he said. To claim it? Venn asked. Yes. And if I don't? Poirot looked at him. Then you remain who you are now. An artist, a guest, a mystery. But if you do, you become the heir of a house you were never allowed to enter. Venn nodded, slowly. He would have hated that. Perhaps, Poirot said. Or perhaps he hoped you would refuse. Venn chuckled, bitter and brief. He'd like that better. Poirot turned to him. You are not your father, nor your uncle. You are what you choose next. He let the words settle. Then quietly. Choose well. Chapter 15. The final gathering. The drawing room had been prepared with care. Curtains drawn to filter the afternoon sun. Chairs arranged in a tight arc before the fireplace. No tea service, no distractions. Just the suspects, the silence, and Hercule Poirot standing before the hearth with his hands gently clasped. It was time. Cecilia Fairfax sat upright, her eyes no longer wide with fear, but narrowed with quiet determination. Lionel Grange, restless, sat at the edge of his seat, fingers drumming against his knee. Beatrice Whodunit remained poised, a folded handkerchief in her lap, her mouth tight with withheld memory. Alan Venn leaned in the shadows near the window, as if trying to become one with the pattern of the drapery. And finally, Inspector Calthorne, seated and guarded, stared straight ahead with a face drained of all pretense. Poirot spoke with calm precision. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, it is now time to draw together the threads of this tapestry. A crime has occurred. Yes. But more than that, a wound was reopened. One stitched shut 20 years ago with silence, secrecy, and cowardice. He turned to Calthorne. You wished to prevent the truth from being known. You called it protection. I call it control. Calthorne said nothing. Poirot continued. You forged the threatening note to Cecilia. You prepared the breakfast setting. You tampered with the glass. Your hope, monsieur, was not murder, but fear. Enough fear to drive her away, to bury the past again. But she didn't sit there, Cecilia said quietly. No, Poirot replied. The colonel did. By chance. And when he died, you panicked. You planted the forged posthumous letter to frame the family. You leaned into suspicion. But you were never the only one who held secrets. He turned to Beatrice. Miss Whodunit, you received letters, annual drawings, from someone you suspected might be Randolph's child. She nodded, eyes brimming. I never told anyone, not even when I saw Alan again after so many years. I thought if I named it, I might destroy it. Poirot gave a slight bow of respect. You acted from love. But silence, as we now know, can be as dangerous as poison. Then he turned to Venn. You, monsieur, lived under a name that was never yours. You were watched but never welcomed, invited but never inherited. You were the shadow, Randolph's ghost made flesh. Venn met Poirot's gaze and said nothing. Poirot stepped back. The colonel knew. He had discovered the truth. He planned to set things right. Perhaps not publicly, not fully, but enough. He revised his will. He drafted a final letter. He placed the signet ring and Randolph's keepsakes in his study, ready to be shown. He looked to everyone now. But someone saw this as a threat, someone who had enforced the silence for 2 decades, someone who believed that the truth would unravel everything, that it would shame the family, that it would shame him. Poirot pointed at Calthorne. You. Calthorne sat motionless. You switched the tea meant for Cecilia. You filled the glass with that strange crimson mixture. Not real blood, but a theatrical illusion. You intended to frighten her into leaving. The colonel drank it by mistake, and once he died, you realized your plan had gone too far. Poirot walked slowly before the group. But the truth cannot be undone. You see, monsieur, the crime you committed was not the death. It was the years of concealment that preceded it. He faced the others now. The colonel was not innocent either. He allowed the deception. He punished those who reminded him of what he could never be, Randolph, Beatrice, even Cecilia's father, Adrian. But in his final days, he tried to undo what had been done. A feeble attempt, perhaps, but an attempt nonetheless. Poirot returned to the center of the room. There are no more secrets, he said. Then he drew a folded paper from his jacket. This, he said, is the true final letter, written by the colonel and hidden in Plutarch's Lives, a book only he ever read, and only Beatrice might have understood the code to find. He handed it to Beatrice, who opened it with care. Her lips parted as she read. Poirot translated the last line aloud. Let the house go where it belongs, not by name, but by worth. He turned to Venn. Whether you accept the inheritance or not, monsieur, you are no longer a shadow. The truth has made you whole. Venn stood slowly. The others remained seated, stunned. Beatrice reached for his hand. He took it. Outside. The sky had turned warm with late afternoon. Light fell through the trees, no longer red or ominous, but gold. The estate was quiet, not because it feared exposure, but because it had finally exhaled. Poirot stepped into the hall, hat in hand. Cecilia followed him out. Will it ever feel like home again? She asked softly. Poirot looked back at the stained glass window, no longer bleeding, only glowing. That depends, he said, on whether you build with stone or forgiveness. He bowed gently. Then, as always, he turned on polished heels and departed into the light. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The following day dawned with an unnatural hush, as though even the wind had chosen to withhold judgment. Windward Grange was no longer the theater of whispered accusations or concealed intentions, but it was not at peace. Not yet. The house now held too many revelations, each heavy with its own consequence. Calthorne had been removed quietly at first light. No cuffs, no fuss. Poirot had insisted on discretion. The man had committed his crime not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear of change, fear of exposure, fear of the truth unraveling the delicate order he had preserved like a shrine. And yet it was in the preservation that rot had taken root. By mid-morning, the household once again gathered in the drawing-room, not as suspects, but as witnesses to the unraveling of the final knot. Poirot stood before them with a sheaf of papers, a polished cane in his hand, and the calm bearing of a man who had walked the full maze of deception and found the one path leading out. I thank you, he began softly, for returning. This Cette dernière étape is not for the police. It is for you, for the house, for the truth that has, for too long, been swallowed. He let the words settle. Colonel Arundel Fairfax was not a sentimental man, but he was, in the end, a man haunted by what he allowed to happen. Randolph's death, Beatrice's exile. The child that lived but was not claimed. Poirot turned to Venn. You were that child. Venn, standing near the window with the letter from Randolph in his coat pocket, said nothing. Poirot continued. The colonel's last days were consumed not with estate matters or military memoirs, but with the reconstruction of a truth buried beneath years of silence. He drafted letters, some mailed, some hidden. He planned to disclose your parentage, Mr. Venn. To restore what was taken. He turned now to the group as a whole. But someone feared what that would mean for the legacy, for the lineage, and for Cecilia, who they believed was not strong enough to weather such revelations. Cecilia looked up, her expression unreadable. Poirot gave a small nod. Calthorne believed he was protecting her. He feared the disruption of identity, and so he constructed a deception, a carefully planned symbolic scene. He tampered with the tea, intending to frighten Cecilia into silence, but the colonel, through chance or intuition, sat in her chair. Poirot stepped forward. The glass, chosen for its faceted red shimmer, was a theatrical touch. The forged letter, a misdirection meant to suggest familial betrayal. He wished to bend suspicion away from himself by pointing it toward the very people he had spent years protecting. Beatrice's voice broke the quiet. But why not just destroy the truth? Why stage anything at all? Poirot turned to her. Because he was cornered. The colonel had begun to act. A new will had been filed. Letters had been composed. And most importantly, Randolph's old effects had been unearthed. He reached into his coat and withdrew one final item, a brass locket. Inside, a sketch of a child's face, drawn by hand, signed with a simple R. I found this behind the false panel in the colonel's writing desk, Poirot said. It was not placed there recently, but it had been moved. Someone had opened the desk in the days before the murder. He passed it to Venn. Alan opened it slowly. His eyes softened, then darkened with realization. He knew. Poirot nodded. Yes, and more. He meant for you to find it. He laid a trail, in letters, in symbols, even in books. Poirot addressed the room again. The code in the funeral notice, the ring wrapped in velvet, the matching pigments. It was a quiet confession, not to the police, but to the house. He paused. And now that confession has been heard. After the gathering dispersed, Poirot found himself alone in the colonel's study. The room no longer bristled with its former rigidity. Sunlight touched the spines of forgotten volumes. A small dust mote danced in the beam that fell across the desk. Beatrice entered quietly. He would never have said it aloud, she said. Poirot looked up. No, he replied, but I believe he hoped to say it with action. She nodded. And the child I lost. He grew up inside the house I wasn't allowed to enter. Poirot folded his hands, but he was not lost, nor forgotten. Beatrice smiled faintly. Perhaps not, but for so many years I feared I had imagined him. Poirot stood and bowed his head. You imagined only what others were afraid to name. Later that day, Poirot took a final walk through the east garden. The rose bushes had not bloomed again. Not yet, but the leaves were healthy and green. The air was lighter. The soil seemed to breathe. Cecilia met him near the arbor, arms crossed, but shoulders looser than they'd been in days. You've unearthed a great deal, Monsieur Poirot. He smiled gently. Sometimes, mademoiselle, one must dig to heal. She hesitated. And now? Now, Poirot said. You begin again. She looked toward the house. Do you think it's still haunted? Of course, he said, smiling faintly. All houses are. But now the ghosts are named. And named ghosts, mademoiselle, lose their sting. Poirot touched the brim of his hat. And, as always, turned to go. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. By the end of the week, Windward Grange had grown unfamiliar to itself. The constables had departed. The halls were no longer heavy with whispered suspicions, and the servants, who had carried the burden of quiet knowing for decades, now moved through the corridors with something almost like relief. The crime, the deception, and the ancestral silence that had choked the estate were out in the open. Justice had not come with shackles alone, but with naming. Hercule Poirot remained 2 days more, quietly reviewing documents, speaking with solicitors, and giving the household time to process what had been exposed. He did not speak of guilt unless asked, and even then he was sparing with condemnation. Some punishments, he knew, were self-sustaining. Calthorne's confession had been formalized in the presence of the Crown Solicitor. He admitted to the forgery, the tampering of the glass, and the switched tea. He insisted again that his intent had never been murder, but a message, a warning. I only wanted her to leave, he said, voice hollow. I didn't want her caught in what Randolph left behind. He was to be held pending trial at the county jail. The charge would be manslaughter, not murder, a lesser but damning verdict. One which would nonetheless strip him of his title, his post, and his reputation. He had served the Fairfax family for nearly 30 years. Now he would leave it nameless. The Colonel's will, the real one, was executed. Lionel Grange, initially named as heir, was found to have no standing. When confronted with this, he merely shook his head. I never wanted it, he muttered. He put my name in that will to stir the pot. That was all. A final insult. I think he hated us all equally. In the end. Poirot had nodded, but said nothing. Lionel left the estate the following day, valise in hand, walking down the gravel path toward the village before dawn. Cecilia watched him go from the landing window. She did not wave. He did not look back. Beatrice Whodunit remained. The letters from Randolph had been catalogued and returned to her at her request. She began working quietly in the East Wing, opening the long disused nursery and turning it into a room of sunlight and paper. She said little of the past, but her silence no longer felt like avoidance. It was something more peaceful now. A silence of space, not repression. Poirot passed her once in the corridor, and she paused. I never imagined, she said, that the truth would feel lighter. Poirot gave a small, warm smile. Mademoiselle, he said, truth does not crush us. It is what we hide that does. Cecilia had assumed temporary stewardship of the estate. The solicitor had confirmed that, by rights, Alan Venn, Randolph's son, could claim both name and property, but Venn had refused. I never lived for this place, he told Poirot. I don't want it to become mine just because of blood. Poirot had nodded. And yet you are the reason it may be reborn. Venn stayed on for a few days longer, helping to clear the attic rooms, burning papers with Beatrice's supervision, even planting 2 new rose bushes by the east arbor. Then he too packed his belongings. He paused by Poirot's room before leaving. I don't know what I am, he said, now that I know what I was. Poirot studied him for a moment. You are the sum of your choices, monsieur, not your birth. Venn shook his head. You should have been a philosopher. No, Poirot replied. Philosophers do not wear patent leather shoes. They shook hands. And Alan Venn walked down the path where Lionel had vanished days earlier, but straighter, quieter, without a backward glance. Poirot departed on the morning train, valise neat, moustache immaculate, coat brushed clean of windward's dust. But he left behind one envelope, sealed, addressed in his fine Belgian script, to Miss Cecilia Fairfax, upon the third sunrise. She opened it as instructed, seated alone in the breakfast room where the red light no longer painted tragedy across the glass. Inside, a single sheet. Mademoiselle, a house cannot carry ghosts, only people can. Yours is not cursed, only burdened. And now the burden is yours to set down or carry forward with light. You are your father's daughter, but more importantly, you are your own. H.P. She folded the letter once, pressed it to her chest, and wept. That evening, with the house lit softly by oil lamps and the last of the storm's dampness finally chased from the walls, Cecilia sat beside Beatrice beneath the old rose arbor. "It feels different now," she said. "The air," Beatrice nodded. "Because nothing is hiding in it." They sat in silence. A bird passed overhead, and in the distance the sea began to hum again, not with warning, but with rhythm. Justice had been served, not with spectacle, but with revelation. The glass that once reflected blood now held only light, and the house, long sealed in ancestral silence, had at last spoken. Chapter 18. The Closing Remark. The train from Cornwall to London passed through wide meadows touched by gold, the morning sun lacing every hedge and treetop with forgiving light. In the compartment, Hercule Poirot sat alone as he preferred, a book unopened in his lap, and a faint smile playing across his lips. His mind was not on the train, nor on London, nor even on the case just closed. It was on the particular art of silence, not the silence of evasion or guilt that he had unmasked too many times to count. No, this was a different silence. The silence of healing, of truth accepted, not buried. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering Windward Grange not as it had been at his arrival, tight with secrets and rusting pride, but as it had been when he left it. Doors open, windows unlatched, no more shadows stretching across the floor where the colonel had once sat in silent judgment. In that final hour, Poirot had walked once more through the breakfast room. No one else had entered with him. He had stood by the window as the light shifted. Still red-tinged, yes, but no longer ominous. The chair, now restored to Cecilia's rightful place, sat gently in its corner. The glass was gone. Only the table remained, wooden, flawed, honest. Poirot had left behind no further instructions, only the note for Cecilia, and the small brass key he placed on the mantel of the colonel's study, beside Randolph's final letter. A key not to a drawer, but to a truth too long locked away. Now, in the rhythm of the train's journey, Poirot let the pieces settle in his mind. The crime had been solved. Calthorne's guilt established, not only in law, but in motive. The colonel's death had been the unintended result of a manipulated routine, a desperate bid to suppress revelation. But in that failure, the truth had forced its way to the surface. Then, the boy who had grown beside his inheritance without knowing it, had chosen not to claim it. Not out of rejection, but out of dignity. And Cecilia had stepped into the space that silence once claimed, not as a replacement heir, but as a rightful voice. She had not flinched from the pain of discovery. She had walked through it, and Beatrice. She had not only regained her past, she had made peace with it. Poirot opened his eyes again. One more thing had lingered in his mind, a final clue, not to guilt, but to motive, the matchbox from the Elgin Hotel. He had examined it again on his last night, alone in his room. Inside, faintly scrawled in pencil on the inside flap, a line, "Let no one bear my shame but me." A quote not from Randolph, but from Arundel Fairfax. The colonel had known all of it, long before his last breath. The inheritance, the cover-up, the child. And in a way that only prideful men can muster, he had planned his own reckoning, not with public scandal, but with quiet redress. He had placed the ring back in the drawer. He had revised the will. He had set the scene for his own confession. And then, by fate or habit, he had sat in the wrong chair, or the right one. Poirot, watching the hedgerows flicker by through the train's window, gave a small nod. There are crimes that stain a reputation, and there are truths that cleanse one. Windward Grange would endure not because of its name, nor its stone, nor its past, but because it had chosen, at last, not to look away. Poirot took up his book and opened it, though he did not read. He simply let the words settle around him. Outside, the world moved on, but inside, everything had found its rightful place. He leaned back, closed his eyes once more, and said aloud to no one, "There is no greater justice than the truth accepted." And then he smiled.